Welcome back. Wednesday, June 2nd, 2021. A few reflections on current contentions, if I might. Last month was Jewish History Month. You remember seeing a lot of history on Jews, or for that matter, the Jewish state? Or, rather, see a lot of distorted history on behalf of Palestinian claims. Yesterday, the Arizona Republic went so far as to publish a Palestinian activist's op-ed where she calls the founding of Israel the Nakba, a catastrophe in Arabic. Anyone know of any other country's founding that a newspaper would allow being called a catastrophe, especially, but regardless of, it being a country of a religious minority? All the while saying that country should negotiate with those who call its very existence a catastrophe? Seems to me it should be hard, if not impossible, to negotiate with those who want you dead. Not much to negotiate, really, is there? Except, I guess, the appetizer for the last meal. Keep in mind, we're to listen to those who call Israel's existence a catastrophe as the moderate camp, by the way, just like that person who wrote the op-ed in the Republic yesterday, which gets me to something I meant to point out. As usual, we can make the clear muddy, and that is a great strategy of the left, the Marxist permanent revolution adherents. Recall, as old Screw Tape says, the purpose is to fuddle them. Almost all of the reporting on what took place over the past 2 weeks in the Middle East was misreported and fuddled, confusedly so. Words like apartheid were thrown around, words like racist and colonialist were thrown around, words like disproportionate and violation of international law were thrown around, and by thrown around I mean printed and stated in every magazine, newspaper, and on every cable channel covering the Middle East. And those words were printed without cavil or question. Much like anything that comes out of Anthony Fauci's mouth is taken as truth and fact without cavil or question, even though his story has changed on a great many issues, even as he admits he has deliberately misled the public for greater goods. Though we've known for years, for example, that almost every data point from the Gaza Strip comes from Hamas, spokesmen and officials, it seems the media has to relearn that it may be an issue when you take a terrorist group propaganda and print it as news and fact. Maybe it doesn't want to relearn that, the media. It just wishes we ignored that that's what we do, but that is what we do, and here we go again. As just reported this morning in the Allgemeiner, the New York Times is retreating from its claim made in a top-of-the-front page, 6-column headline story that the recent Israel-Gaza war left, quote, more than 250 dead, mostly civilians, close quote. Well, a correction published by the Times yesterday confesses that the paper can't substantiate the headline's unattributed claim. Quote, a headline with an article on May 21st about the conflict between Israel and Hamas overstated the death toll in the conflict, and it is not known whether most of those killed were civilians, close quote. Most were civilians was in the headline. They've pretty much, with the correction, just erased the whole story, no? Whatever number does finally get attributed to the fighting, we know a few things already. Most of the Gazan dead were not civilians by a margin of 66%, and nearly 100 of the Gazan dead were killed by rockets misfired by Hamas. In any event, since the Jewish lobby is so strong in America, as I keep being told, now you know why there was such good history on Netflix and major networks during Jewish History Month, just like with Black History Month and other commemorations of those in minority communities. Oh, you don't remember that? That's correct, because it didn't happen. It doesn't happen. It won't. Instead, we get Nakba, catastrophe, apartheid, Rashida Tlaib, and beaten up in major cities from New York to Los Angeles. So, in the spirit of fixing a little of the history, I give you Dennis Prager, who writes, if you've seen videos of recent attacks on Jews in New York City, Los Angeles, London, Miami, elsewhere, you may have missed a very revealing aspect of those attacks. They were almost always, as they have been for decades, accompanied by curses and shouts such as F the Jews. Now, given that the perpetrators are almost always Muslim, whether immigrants or children of immigrants from an Arab or other Muslim country, two questions present themselves. Why attack American or French or British Jews, and why curse the Jews? In other words, given that the recent wars have been between Hamas and Israel, why aren't these attacks outside of Israel on Israelis and Israeli institutions? And why level curses at the Jews? The answer is this. The Muslims who seek Israel's destruction do so because Israel is Jewish, not because Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza. First, the Muslim world sought Israel's destruction from the day Israel was established in May 1948, still calling it the Nakba, the catastrophe. And that was before Israel had a centimeter of West Bank or Gaza. Second, Israel does not occupy Gaza. Israel withdrew completely from Gaza 16 years ago. Third, the Palestinians rejected a state of their own at least 5 times. Rejection number 1 in 1937, the British Peel Commission offered the Arabs 80% of the area then known as Palestine, and the Jews were offered 20%. The Arabs rejected it. Rejection number 2. In 1947, the Arabs rejected the United Nations partition plan. Rejection number 3. In 1967, in the course of defeating the attempt by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to destroy Israel, Israel conquered the West Bank from Jordan, Gaza from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Most Israelis had no interest in retaining Gaza or almost any part of the West Bank except for East Jerusalem, the Jewish city in which Jews have lived for 3,000 years, from 1,400 years before Muhammad was even born. The Palestinians, as the Arabs of Palestine came to be known, and all the Arab states rejected partition and peace. Rejection number 4 in 2000 at Camp David. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat a Palestinian state in all of Gaza, plus 94% of the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. But Arafat rejected the offer. In the words of President Bill Clinton, Arafat was, quote, here 14 days and said no to everything, close quote. Rejection number 5. In 2008, Israel tried again. Prime Minister Olmert went even further than Barak had, expanding the peace offer to include additional land to sweeten the deal, and the Palestinians said no again. The reason for all these rejections of a state of their own was because it also meant a Jewish state in the Middle East would exist. The Middle East dispute has never been about land or the size of land. There are 22 Arab states in the Middle East. One would think there could be room for one small Jewish one. There is even a state with a Palestinian majority, Jordan. The issue is not land. The issue is religion. Why is Iran wholly preoccupied with destroying Israel? It has nothing to do with Muslim solidarity. The Iranians don't care about the Palestinians. It is entirely about hatred of Jews in the Jewish state. If the Iranians cared about fellow Muslims, they would be targeting China, which is accused of genocide against Muslim Uyghurs, a charge that includes forced sterilization of Uyghur women. But Iran would do business with China rather than condemn it. Westerners want to believe this is about land, in part because they are secular and think in secular terms, and in part because they need to believe that the dispute is only about land. Because then they can blame Israel. If it were about a Muslim desire to destroy the Jewish state, they could no longer blame Israel. Even worse, they would have to blame Islamic fanaticism. Other contention. Yesterday, President Biden spoke in Tulsa in a speech that mentioned the KKK a minimum of 8 times. He said, among other things, quote, the flames from those burning crosses torched every region of our country. Millions of white Americans belonged to the Klan, and they weren't even embarrassed by it. They were proud of it. And that hate became embedded systematically and systemically in our laws and culture, close quote. Scott Johnson read the whole speech and concluded that Biden makes it sound like this is where we are today. He skips a few items, such as all history and civil rights law. Common though it has become to invoke systemic this and systemic that, Scott writes, Biden's indictment of the United States on the ground is unforgivable. The United States continues to attract people from every race known to man and from every corner of the world. Name a country that is our equal. There is a pretense in Biden's declaration that he isn't pretending when he says, quote, "We do ourselves no favors by pretending none of this ever happened or doesn't impact us today, because it still does impact us today. We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and not what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, everything. That's what great nations do. They come to terms with their dark sides. And we're a great nation. The only way to build a common ground is to truly repair and to truly rebuild," close quote. Well, as Scott says, good point. It's a shame that he didn't bring up the mania of destruction, rioting, and tearing down, which we have lived through with the complicity and support of Democrats all over the United States for a year and a half. That dark side doesn't come from 100 years ago, by the way. It's here today and present in this administration. Jason Riley at the Wall Street Journal gets the point just right. He says these historical milestones, like the Tulsa Memorial, are certainly worthy of commemoration. Properly understood, they demonstrate how much racial progress has been made in this country in a relatively short time. Yet for progressives and their friends in the media, the events are also an opportunity to push for racial preferences and bigger government. The goal is to link today's racial disparities to past wrongs and play down or ignore the far more significant role that contemporary black behavior plays in social inequality. That is the key to all of this. Past wrongs are used to play down and ignore the far more significant wrongs that are taking place now. When a national public radio reporter asked George Patrick Evans, Selma's mayor, how events of 50 years ago fit into the current conversation about race, he balked. He said, quote, and he's black, he said, "I'm not sure how it fits. We have a lot more crime going on in 2015 all over this country than we had in 1965. Segregation existed, but we didn't have the crime." Asked about the city's high black unemployment rate, he still refused to racialize the issue. Quote, "Well, from the standpoint of jobs, we have lots of jobs. It's just that a lot of people do not have the skill level to man these jobs, and that's the biggest problem we have," close quote. It's worth noting that the black residents of Tulsa 100 years ago didn't wait around for the federal government to come to their rescue. Within 2 decades of the riots, homes and churches had been rebuilt and black-owned businesses again anchored the community. The political left is much more interested in black suffering than in black accomplishment. But black history is about more than victimization at the hands of whites. Black Tulsa residents of nearly a century ago would also be shocked to learn that it is no longer racist white vigilantes, but black criminals who pose the biggest threat to safety in their communities. Liberals blame today's disproportionately high black criminality on the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, but violent crime among blacks declined in the 1940s, then dropped even further in the 1950s, while remaining relatively stable among whites. In other words, blacks living during Jim Crow segregation and much closer to the era of slavery experienced significantly lower rates of violent crime and incarceration, both in absolute terms and relative to whites. How thus can it be a legacy of all that? The Biden administration would much rather discuss white criminal behavior in Tulsa 100 years ago than black criminal behavior in Chicago, Baltimore, or St. Louis today. But that won't save lives. If one believes black lives matter today or tomorrow, but then again, if one were serious about lives, all lives, black or white, Joe Biden and his party are about the last precinct to turn to, even when one thinks about the obsession of Joe Biden's, the KKK. It's not America that needs to apologize for the KKK. It's not Republicans or MAGA supporters who need to apologize for the KKK. Who does? Well, let me quote directly from PBS.org, Public Broadcasting System station, in an article titled "Grant, Reconstruction, and the KKK." Here is the opening to their essay at PBS. Quote, "At the time of Ulysses S. Grant's election to the presidency, white supremacists were conducting a reign of terror throughout the South. In outright defiance of the Republican-led federal government, Southern Democrats formed organizations that violently intimidated blacks and Republicans who tried to win political power. The most prominent of these, the Ku Klux Klan, formed in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. Again, it's not Americans or Republicans who need to apologize for the past Joe Biden keeps bringing up as responsible for today's problems. And it's not the Jews who are responsible for terrorism and targeting civilians. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.